Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we are diving straight into the architectural breakdown of a psychological prison. We're looking at the harrowing, long-term captivity of Colleen Stan. But we're not just recounting the story. We are analyzing the exact mechanisms of how coercive control is built, maintained, and ultimately, how it gets destroyed from the inside out.
To do that, here is our blueprint for today. We'll cover 6 phases: anatomy of systemic instability, cracking the load-bearing wall, fall of the invisible fence, the paralysis of freedom, the ultimate stress test, and finally, total system collapse. Let's jump right in.
Think about it. How exactly does a prison without physical walls finally collapse? It's a totally counterintuitive concept, right? I mean, when we think of escapes, we usually picture dramatic physical breakouts, over the wall, through the fence. But the reality for victims of long-term coercive control, they rarely just physically break out. Actually, the system holding them fractures from internal fatigue. It's a slow, progressive system failure, not some sudden cinematic event. Part 1. Anatomy of systemic instability. You really have to see the stark contrast between how this captivity system started and how it evolved over time. In the early days, it was all about strict physical confinement, what the source material calls box dominance, extremely high control, very physical. But look at the later phase. There's a massive shift. The physical restrictions drop way down, and the whole system starts relying almost entirely on belief and compliance. Specifically, they used a totally fabricated myth called the company. This shift is absolutely crucial because it proves the system was no longer stable enough to rely on brute force alone. It had to evolve to survive. Moving to Part 2, cracking the load-bearing wall. Now, to maintain this massive illusion, you need perfect coordination between the captors, Cameron and Janice. But sustained deception, that creates massive internal fractures. Janice Hooker essentially became the system's weakest load-bearing wall. She didn't just rebel overnight. It was more like, well, complete psychological overload playing out in 3 steps. First, she was an active participant, right? She actively reinforced Cameron's authority. But then, living this bizarre double life, playing normal family while hiding a prisoner, pushed her into extreme psychological discomfort. Finally, the emotional weight of that prolonged harm sparked a severe moral conflict. The cognitive dissonance of propping up the fake company literally just became too heavy for her to carry. And that brings us to the dramatic fulcrum of the entire collapse. Just 5 words. Janice confessed to Colleen, "The company is not real." Boom. That reality-shattering sentence wasn't just breaking a house rule. By saying that, Janice essentially took a sledgehammer to the primary structural pillar of the captivity. Which brings us to Part 3, fall of the invisible fence. Up until that exact moment, the myth of the company functioned as this impenetrable, invisible perimeter fence. It completely controlled Colleen's risk perception, her logic, even her ability to imagine escaping. It was way more powerful than any physical chain. So when that invisible fence suddenly evaporated, it caused immediate, intense cognitive shock. Basically, it's a sudden, violent contradiction of your lived reality that causes profound confusion, disbelief, and emotional destabilization. The authority system vanished into thin air. Part 4. The paralysis of freedom. But here is the wildest, most counterintuitive part of all this. The physical escape didn't happen right after the myth was broken. Colleen was suddenly trapped in this terrible state of cognitive paralysis. Think about it. Her brain is caught between 2 completely competing realities. On one hand, years of conditioning are screaming that escape equals death. On the other hand, she has this brand new information: the company is a total fake. Knowing the truth intellectually doesn't just magically undo years of intense trauma conditioning. Those old fear responses, they stay highly active. Psychologists have a term for this: learned helplessness. Basically, years of constant reinforcement create a passive acceptance of control. It diminishes your agency and breeds a really profound distrust of your own autonomy. The system had trained Colleen so deeply to rely on an external structure, even a horribly abusive one, that the very concept of freedom felt totally unsafe and incredibly murky. It's like a muscle that is completely atrophied. Part 5. The ultimate stress test. So, driven by total overconfidence in his mind control, Cameron makes a massive miscalculation. He initiates a controlled release, allowing Colleen to take an unsupervised visit to her family. Now, he didn't present this as an escape. He framed it as conditional, temporary freedom, with a heavily implied expectation that she'd come back. He genuinely assumed her psychological conditioning was bulletproof. But this strategic error was the ultimate structural stress test, because suddenly the system is operating with zero physical enforcement. It is relying 100% on her internalized fear. Re-entering the outside world triggered severe environmental shock. We're talking about a brutal identity clash. She was literally torn between Kay, which was the constructed, completely compliant identity she had to build under control, and Colleen Stan, her true pre-captivity self. Being exposed to normal social environments, talking to her family, just being in public spaces, it created massive cognitive dissonance and emotional instability. She was struggling to even process what safety meant anymore. And this exposes a really profound truth that we need to take away from this. External freedom does not immediately equal psychological freedom. Let me say that again. Even though she was physically outside that house, standing right there with her family, her internal model of reality was still completely restricted by the lingering, invisible architecture of her captivity. Part 6. Total system collapse. The definitive failure of this whole coercive system finally arrived at the ultimate decision point. The system completely collapsed the exact moment Colleen decided not to return. This is the big shift. It was her first full rejection of that internalized control. And the psychological mechanism happening here is amazing. The learned fear response finally stopped overriding her decision-making. Her new evaluation of reality, the fact that she was actually free and the threat was totally fabricated, finally became dominant. The system failed, not because of some external physical override, but the second she stopped believing it defined her reality. Once those psychological walls fell, the external collapse happened lightning fast. First, Colleen discloses her experience, making the nightmare verifiable. That leads to law enforcement investigating and collecting all the physical evidence of the confinement system. And that, of course, culminates in the arrest and conviction of Cameron Hooker. By simply communicating her experience to the outside world, the invisible prison turned into hard, investigatable evidence. The system was legally dismantled. Looking at the big picture, this explainer really highlights that any coercive control system absolutely depends on 3 aligned pillars to keep its structural integrity. You need isolation, controlled belief, and multi-person reinforcement. So what's our major takeaway here? Coercive control systems unravel when belief, fear, and participation no longer align. When internal contradictions and psychological fatigue compromise those 3 pillars, the entire architecture simply cracked under its own weight. Which leaves us to really deeply reconsider the nature of captivity itself. I'm going to leave you with this final provocative thought. If the deepest prisons are built in the mind, when does true freedom actually begin? Is it the moment the physical door swings open? Or is it that exact quiet moment when the mind simply refuses to believe in the lock? Thanks for joining me for this explainer. Keep learning, keep questioning, and I'll catch you next time.